In 1951, one of the oldest civilizations on Earth made a devastating discovery that a bankrupt island nation thousands of miles away controlled every single drop of its national wealth. Iran sat upon an ocean of black gold beneath its ancient soil, yet its own people struggled daily to afford bread, medicine, or even the most basic necessities of life. How did a fading empire on the very edge of financial ruin manage to seize and hold the natural wealth of a proud sovereign nation for more than 50 years? Welcome to True Earth History, where hidden history comes to life. Subscribe to uncover the truth behind the headlines. This extraordinary story begins not in the scorching deserts of Iran, but inside the grand offices of London, where desperate men were searching for any way to rescue their dying empire. At the dawn of the 20th century, the British Empire stood as the most powerful force on Earth, controlling vast territories spanning every single inhabited continent across the globe. But maintaining an empire of such extraordinary size demanded something that the rainy British Isles simply did not possess in any meaningful abundance, and that critical something was energy. Coal had powered the Industrial Revolution and made Britain wealthy beyond all measure, but a new era was dawning where liquid fuel would determine which nations ruled the world. Naval supremacy formed the very backbone of British global dominance, and the Royal Navy was slowly transitioning its enormous warship fleet from coal-burning engines to modern oil-powered ones. Winston Churchill, who was then serving as the First Lord of the Admiralty, understood this historic energy transition better than almost anyone else in the entire British government at that time. Churchill famously declared that whoever controlled the global supply of oil would effectively control the entire future of warfare, trade, and international power for many generations to come. But Britain faced a very serious and growing problem. The nation possessed almost no oil reserves of its own, and buying fuel from foreign companies meant dangerous dependence on outside sources. Meanwhile, thousands of miles to the east, a wealthy and ambitious British investor named William Knox Darcy had turned his determined sights toward the ancient and mysterious land of Persia. In 1901, Darcy traveled to Persia and negotiated a breathtaking concession from the aging and financially desperate Shah, Mozaffar ad-Din Shah, of the ruling Qajar royal dynasty. The agreement granted Darcy exclusive rights to search for, extract, and profit from petroleum across nearly 500,000 square miles of Persian territory for a full 60 consecutive years. In exchange for surrendering control over this vast natural resource, Persia would receive a mere 16% of net profits, a shockingly small fraction of its own rightful national wealth. The aging Shah signed away the future of his entire nation for quick money, never truly grasping the immense and almost incomprehensible value of what lay hidden beneath the Persian sands. For 7 long and exhausting years after that agreement, Darcy and his drilling teams worked across the harsh and unforgiving Iranian landscape, spending fortunes while finding nothing but dry, empty wells. The scorching desert heat was nearly unbearable. Tropical diseases swept regularly through the drilling camps, and workers suffered under conditions that would be considered absolutely criminal by any modern standard. By 1908, Darcy was nearly bankrupt and seriously considering abandoning the entire venture altogether, but then something truly extraordinary happened in a remote and desolate corner of southwestern Persia. On May 26, 1908, at a lonely site called Masjid Suleiman, a massive column of crude oil erupted violently from deep within the earth and shot high into the sky. It was the very first major oil discovery in the entire Middle East region, and it would fundamentally change the course of world history in ways nobody could have imagined. Almost overnight, the desolate Iranian landscape was transformed from a seemingly worthless expanse of sand and rock into the most strategically valuable piece of real estate on the entire planet. Within just a few months, a new company called the Anglo Persian Oil Company was officially formed in London to manage, extract, and profit from this incredible new petroleum resource. The company rapidly constructed pipelines, refineries, and export terminals across the southern regions of Iran, building a massive industrial infrastructure entirely owned, controlled, and operated by British interests alone. The enormous Abadan refinery, built on a small island where the river met the waters of the Persian Gulf, would eventually grow to become the single largest oil refinery in the world. Thousands upon thousands of Iranian workers labored in brutally harsh conditions to construct and operate these vast industrial facilities, earning wages so pitifully low they could barely feed their own families. British employees lived inside comfortable gated residential compounds with swimming pools, manicured gardens, and tennis courts, enjoying a privileged lifestyle that stood in deeply shocking contrast to their immediate surroundings. Iranian workers, under deliberate company policy, were housed in overcrowded makeshift shelters without any access to clean running water, reliable electricity, or proper sanitation facilities of any kind whatsoever. This divide was not accidental or coincidental. It was a carefully and deliberately maintained system of racial separation designed to remind everyone exactly who held the power in that arrangement. When the First World War erupted violently across Europe in 1914, Britain suddenly found itself in desperate and immediate need of a secure, reliable, and affordable source of fuel oil. Winston Churchill seized the strategic moment and convinced the British government to purchase a controlling 51% ownership stake in the Anglo Persian Oil Company for just £2 million. With that single historic financial transaction, the British government itself now directly owned and controlled the largest and most productive oil operation anywhere in the entire Middle Eastern region. It was no longer merely a private business venture, it had been transformed into a powerful instrument of imperial grand strategy, an economic weapon disguised as an ordinary commercial enterprise. Iranian oil fueled the warships of the Royal Navy, powered military vehicles across distant battlefields, and gave the British Empire a critical strategic advantage throughout the long and devastating Great War. Iran received almost nothing meaningful in return for this immense and vital contribution, as the enormous profits flowed steadily out of the country, enriching London while leaving Tehran deeply impoverished. After the Great War finally ended, the British grip on Iranian oil only grew tighter and more exploitative, and the already unfair terms of the original concession became even worse. The Anglo Persian Oil Company routinely manipulated its accounting records and financial books to minimize the profits it officially reported, which directly reduced the already tiny royalty payments owed to Iran. Iranian government officials repeatedly sent formal written requests for access to the financial records of the company, but they were refused every single time with polite excuses and deliberate delays. The Iranian people were growing increasingly angry and deeply resentful, watching foreign workers live in visible luxury on their own sovereign soil, while their nation remained desperately poor and completely underdeveloped. By the early 1920s, a formidable military officer named Reza Khan had risen through the ranks of the Persian Cossack Brigade and effectively seized total control of the national government. In 1925, Reza Khan crowned himself Shah, establishing the Pahlavi dynasty and making bold promises to modernize Iran, restore its ancient dignity, and forcefully reclaim its lost national sovereignty. He officially renamed the country from Persia to Iran in 1935, deliberately signaling a decisive break with the colonial past and a firm commitment to building a proud new national identity. Reza Shah attempted to renegotiate the deeply unfair oil concession in 1932, frustrated beyond measure by the pitiful royalty payments Iran continued receiving from the exploitation of its own resources. In a bold and dramatic act of national defiance, the Shah publicly cancelled the original Darcy concession in its entirety, sending immediate shockwaves through the corridors of power in London. Britain responded with swift and aggressive military threats, dispatching Royal Navy warships to the Persian Gulf, and pressuring international institutions to intervene forcefully on behalf of British commercial interests. Faced with overwhelming military force and intense diplomatic pressure from multiple powerful directions, Reza Shah was reluctantly forced to accept a new agreement in 1933 that was barely better. This revised concession extended the duration of the arrangement by 32 additional years, pushing the expiration date all the way to 1993 and guaranteeing continued British control for decades more. Iran would now receive slightly higher fixed payments per ton of oil extracted, but the Iranian government still had absolutely no voice in how the company made its operational decisions. The company continued unilaterally setting its own production levels, determining its own export prices, and making every major strategic decision without ever consulting or informing the Iranian government about anything. Iranian workers remained strictly and deliberately segregated from their British counterparts at every level, earning a small fraction of comparable wages and enduring intentionally inferior living and working conditions daily. During the Second World War, Britain and the Soviet Union jointly invaded Iran in August of 1941, determined to secure its vital oil fields and protect critically important military supply routes. Reza Shah, who had maintained cautious but increasingly friendly diplomatic relationships with Germany, was forcibly removed from his throne and sent into permanent exile far from his beloved homeland forever. His young and inexperienced son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was placed upon the ancient peacock throne as a compliant figurehead ruler who would reliably serve the strategic interests of the Allies. The military invasion and subsequent foreign occupation of Iran during those devastating war years deeply humiliated the Iranian people and reinforced their painful belief that powerful nations viewed them with contempt. When the Second World War finally ended in 1945, Britain emerged on the winning side but was left financially devastated and struggling desperately under the crushing weight of enormous national debts. British cities lay in ruins from relentless bombing. Vital industries had been severely damaged, and the national treasury was almost completely empty after 6 absolutely exhausting years of total global warfare. In this moment of profound imperial weakness and growing financial desperation, Iranian oil became more critically important to Britain than at any previous point in its entire history and existence. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, as it had been officially renamed, was generating massive annual profits that flowed directly into British government accounts and helped fund the slow and painful post-war recovery. In the single year of 1950, the company reported annual profits exceeding £200 million, while Iran received a mere £16 million in total royalty payments from its own oil. The British government collected more money in corporate taxes from the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company than the entire nation of Iran received in royalties for its own natural resources that year. The British tax collector was earning more from Iranian oil than Iran itself was receiving, a documented historical fact so deeply absurd that it genuinely sounds like someone invented it as fiction. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean, a dramatically different and far more equitable model of oil extraction was emerging that made the entire British arrangement with Iran look absolutely outrageous. In 1950, the Arabian American Oil Company formally agreed to divide its total profits with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia on a fair and genuinely equal 50-50 basis. Venezuela had already successfully negotiated similar equal profit-sharing terms with its own foreign oil companies, clearly proving that producing nations could demand and actually receive their genuinely fair share. Iranian politicians, intellectuals, and newspaper editors pointed urgently to these new international examples and asked one simple but absolutely devastating question that echoed powerfully through the streets of Tehran. If Saudi Arabia and Venezuela could each receive half of the profits from their own oil, then why was Iran still forced to accept terms that gave it almost nothing? The answer to that painful question was both simple and infuriating. Britain had no genuine intention of offering Iran fair terms because the bankrupt empire simply could not afford to. A crumbling and desperate empire was clinging to the wealth of another sovereign nation, like a drowning man gripping a piece of floating wreckage in a violent and rising storm. Into this volatile and increasingly explosive political atmosphere stepped one of the most remarkable and controversial figures in all of Iranian history, a tall, elderly politician named Mohammad Mosaddegh. Mosaddegh came from a distinguished, aristocratic Persian family of considerable wealth and prestige, and had received his advanced education in Europe, earning a doctorate in law from a Swiss university. He was passionate, emotional, and intensely patriotic, widely known for weeping openly during his parliamentary speeches and occasionally fainting from the overwhelming intensity of his own deep personal convictions. Western diplomats and foreign journalists frequently mocked his dramatic personal style, but ordinary Iranian people absolutely adored Mosaddegh because he spoke truths that everyone felt but few dared express openly. Mosaddegh believed with absolute and unwavering conviction that Iranian oil belonged solely to the Iranian people, a principle so basic and self-evident that it should never have required debate. In 1949, he won election to the Iranian parliament known as the Majlis, and quickly established himself as the most powerful and vocal champion, demanding full nationalization of the oil industry. Nationalization meant that Iran would assume complete ownership and operational control of its own petroleum industry, ending decades of systematic foreign exploitation and finally keeping its own rightful profits at home. The idea of oil nationalization electrified the Iranian public, uniting people across social classes, religious backgrounds, and political affiliations in a way that very few movements in Iranian history ever had. Massive crowds of enthusiastic and passionate supporters gathered daily in the streets and public squares of Tehran, demanding loudly that their elected representatives vote immediately to support full oil nationalization. On March 15, 1951, the Iranian parliament voted unanimously and without a single dissenting voice to nationalize the entire oil industry, a historic decision that sent shockwaves around the globe. Just 2 months after that historic vote, Mohammad Mosaddegh was formally appointed as Prime Minister of Iran, given a clear and overwhelming popular mandate to implement the nationalization law. In the halls of power in London, the official British reaction to nationalization was one of pure outrage and genuine disbelief at what they openly considered an act of brazen theft. Senior British officials simply could not accept or comprehend that Iran had both the audacity and the legal sovereign right to reclaim full control over its own valuable natural resources. The British government viewed nationalization not merely as a commercial dispute over profits and contracts, but as a direct and existential threat to the continued survival of the entire empire. If Iran could successfully nationalize its oil industry and survive all consequences, then what would stop Egypt from seizing the Suez Canal or other nations from reclaiming their exploited resources? The dominoes could begin falling rapidly across the entire developing world, and Britain would permanently lose the economic foundations that kept its fragile and overstretched imperial structure from total collapse. Britain immediately launched a comprehensive and absolutely ruthless campaign designed to destroy Iran economically, isolate it diplomatically, and destabilize it politically using every single available tool of imperial power. The Royal Navy established an aggressive naval blockade of all Iranian oil exports, intercepting and directly threatening any foreign tanker ship that dared attempt to carry Iranian crude oil to market. All British technicians, engineers, and skilled operational managers were immediately ordered to leave the Abadan refinery, effectively shutting down its complex operations and crippling Iranian oil production almost completely overnight. Major British banks swiftly froze all Iranian financial assets and international accounts, cutting the country off from global markets and making it virtually impossible to conduct any normal foreign trade. Britain simultaneously filed a formal legal case against Iran at the International Court of Justice in The Hague, arguing that nationalization directly violated the terms of the existing concession agreement. Mosaddegh personally traveled to The Hague and delivered a brilliant and deeply passionate legal defense that captivated international audiences and earned widespread admiration across the entire developing world and beyond. He argued eloquently and persuasively that no sovereign nation could ever be legally compelled to surrender permanent control of its own natural resources to a foreign corporation under any circumstances. The International Court ultimately ruled in favor of Iran, officially declaring that it lacked proper jurisdiction over what was fundamentally a dispute between a sovereign nation and a foreign company. It was a stunning and historic legal victory for Mosaddegh and for Iran, but unfortunately the ruling did absolutely nothing to relieve the devastating economic pressure that Britain was relentlessly applying. The British naval blockade was slowly but effectively strangling the Iranian economy from the outside. Oil revenues had collapsed to nearly zero, and the government was running desperately short of funds. Mosaddegh made urgent appeals to the United States for both economic and diplomatic support, genuinely believing that Americans would naturally sympathize with a democratic nation fighting bravely against colonial exploitation. President Truman initially showed some understanding of the Iranian position, privately acknowledging that the British had been extracting Iranian wealth on terms that were clearly and deeply unjust to Iran. But in January 1953, a new president named Dwight Eisenhower took office in Washington, and he viewed the entire unfolding situation through a very different and far more dangerous political lens. The Cold War had transformed American foreign policy into a paranoid and obsessive campaign against anything that even remotely resembled the spread of communist influence anywhere on the entire globe. British intelligence officers, led by experienced operatives from the Secret Intelligence Service, understood this new American obsession perfectly and decided to exploit it with calculated and deliberate precision. They traveled to Washington and presented a carefully constructed argument to senior American officials, claiming that Mosaddegh was dangerously weakening Iran and leaving it completely vulnerable to a communist takeover. The British strategists knew that America would never intervene simply to protect British oil profits, but framing the crisis as a battle against communism changed the entire conversation almost immediately. In reality, Mosaddegh was a deeply committed nationalist Democrat who actually opposed communism quite firmly, but that inconvenient truth did not fit the story that Britain desperately needed America to believe. The Tudeh Party, which was the official communist political organization in Iran, did exist and had some genuine popular support, but Mosaddegh had consistently and deliberately kept them at a distance. Nevertheless, the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency under Director Alan Dulles eagerly embraced the British narrative, and together they began secretly planning a covert operation to overthrow the democratically elected government. The operation was given the classified codename Ajax by the Americans and was simultaneously called Operation Boot by their British counterparts, reflecting the coordinated nature of this extraordinary secret conspiracy. Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of former President Theodore Roosevelt, was personally selected to lead the covert operation on the ground inside Iran, arriving secretly in Tehran during the summer of 1953. Roosevelt carried suitcases filled with American cash, reportedly containing millions of dollars intended for bribing politicians, military officers, newspaper editors, religious leaders, and professional street agitators throughout Iran. The plan was both deviously simple and breathtakingly ambitious: create enough chaos, confusion, and fear inside Iran that the military would feel justified in stepping forward and seizing control from Mosaddegh. Paid agents provocateurs began organizing violent street demonstrations in Tehran, deliberately creating an atmosphere of manufactured crisis and political instability designed to make the government appear weak and incompetent. Newspapers that had been secretly purchased with foreign intelligence funds published relentless propaganda attacking Mosaddegh daily, accusing him of being a communist sympathizer and a dangerous threat to national stability. Religious leaders who had received substantial payments from intelligence operatives delivered fiery sermons in mosques across the country, turning segments of the faithful population against their own democratically chosen prime minister. Senior military officers were approached individually and offered enormous bribes, prestigious promotions, and firm promises of future power in exchange for their willing participation in the planned overthrow of the government. The young Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was initially hesitant and deeply afraid to participate in the conspiracy, but intense pressure from both British and American intelligence operatives eventually overcame his personal resistance. On August 15, 1953, the Shah signed royal decrees dismissing Mosaddegh from his position as Prime Minister and appointing a retired military general named Fazlollah Zahedi as his official replacement. But the initial attempt to deliver these dismissal decrees failed dramatically when Mosaddegh received advance warning of the plot and ordered the immediate arrest of the military officers who carried them. The terrified Shah panicked completely upon hearing the news that the first coup attempt had failed, and he immediately fled Iran aboard a small aircraft, escaping first to Baghdad. For a brief and glorious moment, it genuinely appeared that Mosaddegh had successfully defeated the foreign conspiracy and preserved Iranian democracy against the combined intelligence agencies of two major world powers. Celebrations erupted spontaneously across Tehran. Jubilant crowds poured into the streets cheering wildly, and Mossadegh supporters believed that their beloved prime minister had triumphed in the face of impossible odds. But Kermit Roosevelt, operating from a secret basement location inside the American embassy compound in Tehran, refused to accept defeat and immediately began organizing a second and more aggressive attempt. On August 19, 1953, a date permanently burned into the collective memory of the Iranian nation, the second and final phase of Operation Ajax was violently and decisively launched. Massive crowds of paid agitators hired gang members and recruited strongmen from the athletic clubs and traditional gymnasiums of South Tehran, flooded into the city streets in coordinated waves. Military tanks rolled through the boulevards of the capital. Soldiers loyal to the conspirators seized control of key government buildings, radio stations, and critical military installations across the entire city. Violent street battles erupted between supporters and opponents of Mosaddegh throughout Tehran, and by the end of that single terrible and historically decisive day, hundreds of Iranian lives were tragically lost. Mosaddegh, the democratically elected prime minister, who had dared to demand that Iran control its own national wealth, was arrested at his private residence as tanks destroyed his garden walls. He emerged from the rubble of his own home with quiet dignity, surrendering peacefully to the soldiers while knowing that everything he had fought and sacrificed for was being violently destroyed. General Zahedi was installed as the new prime minister, and the Shah was immediately invited back from his brief exile abroad, returning to Tehran in triumph to reclaim his golden throne. The coup was presented to the world through carefully managed propaganda as a spontaneous popular uprising by the Iranian people themselves against an incompetent and dangerously radical prime minister who had failed. Western newspapers and international media largely accepted and repeated this deliberately fabricated narrative without serious question, and the true foreign involvement remained officially hidden from public knowledge for many years. Mosaddegh was put on trial before a military tribunal on charges of treason against the Iranian crown, a deeply ironic accusation against a man whose only real crime was loving his country. During his trial, Mosaddegh delivered passionate and defiant speeches defending the sacred principle of national sovereignty, declaring that the oil beneath Iranian soil belonged to no one except the Iranian people. He was found guilty and sentenced to 3 years in solitary confinement in a military prison, after which he was permanently banished to his rural estate under strict house arrest. Mohammad Mosaddegh spent the final 14 years of his life in enforced isolation at his country home, forbidden from participating in politics, receiving most visitors, or speaking publicly ever again. He died on March 5, 1967, at the age of 84, a broken and isolated old man whose grand democratic vision for Iran had been ruthlessly crushed by foreign powers. With Mosaddegh permanently removed from power, the urgent business of redistributing Iranian oil wealth could proceed exactly according to the plans that London and Washington had carefully prepared in advance. A new international oil consortium was established in 1954 to manage the Iranian petroleum industry, and its ownership structure revealed the true underlying motivations behind the entire devastating coup operation. British Petroleum, the direct corporate successor of the original Anglo Persian Oil Company, received a generous 40% ownership share, maintaining a dominant position in the industry it had once monopolized. A group of 5 major American oil corporations collectively received another 40% share, serving as the clearly understood reward for the essential role that American intelligence had played. Royal Dutch Shell received 14%, and a French petroleum company received the remaining 6%, completing a distribution that gave Western corporations total control over Iranian oil once again. Iran now technically owned its oil in legal name only, while foreign companies maintained complete operational control over every aspect of extraction, refining, pricing, and global distribution of the product. It was nationalization in name painted over foreign domination in practice, a masterful illusion designed to appear fair while ensuring that real power and genuine profits remained firmly in Western hands. The Shah consolidated absolute dictatorial power with the full and enthusiastic backing of both Britain and the United States, who viewed him as a reliable and obedient strategic partner. He established a feared and ruthless secret police force known by its Persian acronym, trained and equipped by both the Central Intelligence Agency and the Israeli Intelligence Service from its inception. This organization systematically crushed all forms of political dissent, labor organizing, free press activity, and democratic opposition across every level of Iranian society with documented and systematic brutality. Thousands of Iranian citizens were arrested, imprisoned, tortured, and in many documented cases permanently disappeared simply for expressing political opinions or criticizing the policies and decisions of the government. The Shah spent lavishly on himself, his enormous royal family, and on prestigious military equipment, purchased primarily from the United States, while millions of ordinary Iranians continued living in deep poverty. In 1971, the Shah hosted an extraordinarily extravagant celebration at the ancient ruins of Persepolis to commemorate 2,500 years of continuous Persian monarchy, at an estimated cost exceeding $200 million. World leaders, royalty, and international celebrities feasted on gourmet food specially prepared by chefs flown in from France, while in nearby villages, Iranian children suffered from severe malnutrition and preventable diseases. The obscene contrast between imperial excess and widespread public suffering fueled a growing underground resistance movement that would eventually transform into one of the most dramatic revolutions in all modern history. By the late 1970s, the Iranian people had endured 25 years of dictatorship installed and continuously maintained by foreign powers, and their collective patience had finally reached its absolute breaking point. In 1979, a massive popular revolution swept through Iran like an unstoppable wave, toppling the Shah from his golden throne and sending him fleeing into permanent exile from his homeland. The revolution drew support from an extraordinarily broad coalition, including religious conservatives, secular liberals, university students, industrial workers, and many others united only by their shared opposition to tyranny. The Shah wandered from country to country seeking asylum, a man who once commanded vast armies and controlled enormous wealth, now unwanted and rejected by even his former closest allies. He died in exile in Egypt on July 27, 1980, the final and deeply symbolic end of a dynasty that had been placed on the throne and sustained entirely by foreign power. The 1979 revolution led to the establishment of an Islamic Republic in Iran, a dramatic political transformation whose complex consequences continue to profoundly shape international relations and regional politics to this very day. Many Western analysts and commentators express surprise and confusion at the deeply anti-Western character of the revolution, seemingly unable or unwilling to understand where such intense hostility could possibly originate. But for the Iranian people, the answer was painfully and abundantly clear. They had not forgotten 1953, and they had not forgotten who destroyed their last real experience of genuine democracy. The memory of Mosaddegh and the foreign orchestrated coup lived on as an open and still painful wound in the national consciousness of Iran, passed from generation to generation without fading. In the year 2000, the United States government finally and officially acknowledged for the first time that American intelligence had indeed played a significant and decisive role in the 1953 Iranian coup. Declassified government documents released over subsequent years confirmed in extraordinary and undeniable detail everything that Iranian people had been saying about foreign interference for nearly half a century. These released documents revealed the specific operational methods used, the precise amounts of money distributed, the individual names of key participants, and the calculated strategies employed to destroy Iranian democracy. In 2013, the Central Intelligence Agency formally declassified additional internal documents that explicitly confirmed American and British responsibility for organizing and executing the overthrow of Prime Minister Mohammad Mosaddegh in 1953. The confirmation came exactly 60 years too late. The damage had already been done. A democratic government had been destroyed, and the course of history had been irreversibly and tragically altered. British officials had been notably more reluctant to publicly acknowledge their leading role in the conspiracy, and a full formal official apology from the British government has never been issued to Iran. The story of the 1953 coup raises profoundly uncomfortable questions about democracy, sovereignty, and the deeply troubling willingness of powerful nations to destroy the self-determination of weaker ones for profit. Britain did not simply stumble into this arrangement through accident or misunderstanding. It deliberately constructed and aggressively maintained a systematic structure designed to extract the maximum possible wealth from a sovereign nation. When that profitable structure was legally and democratically challenged by the rightful owners of the resource, Britain chose to destroy a democracy rather than accept the loss of its revenue. The economic mathematics of this historical arrangement remain absolutely staggering when examined with any honest and careful attention to the actual numbers involved over the full 50-year period. Historians estimate that Britain extracted the equivalent of hundreds of billions of dollars in current value from Iranian oil fields over the course of the entire concession period. That vast wealth financed British military operations, funded the construction of modern infrastructure across the United Kingdom, and helped sustain the British welfare state through its most critical formative years. Meanwhile, Iran, the nation that actually owned the oil, received only a tiny fraction of this enormous generated wealth and was left with crumbling infrastructure and deep underdevelopment across most areas. The pipelines carried wealth in only one direction, from the ancient lands of Iran to the industrial centers of Britain, a one-way flow maintained by legal manipulation and military force. This pattern was not unique to Iran. It was a model repeated across the developing world wherever imperial powers discovered valuable resources beneath the soil of nations too weak to resist. From the rubber plantations of the Congo to the diamond mines of southern Africa, the fundamental structure was always the same. Local resources extracted for foreign profit under deeply unequal terms. What makes the Iranian story particularly significant is how clearly it demonstrates the connection between resource extraction, the suppression of democracy, and the creation of long-lasting international conflicts and tensions. The 1953 coup did not simply remove one prime minister from power, it fundamentally shattered the Iranian people of their faith in Western promises of democracy, freedom, and fair international dealings. Every subsequent political crisis involving Iran, from the 1979 revolution to the hostage crisis to modern nuclear tensions, carries within it the unresolved legacy and deep scars of 1953. Understanding this history does not excuse any actions taken by any government, but it provides essential context that is too often deliberately ignored or conveniently forgotten in modern political discussions. The story also reveals how financial desperation can transform even supposedly democratic nations into aggressive imperial predators willing to commit acts of profound injustice to preserve their own economic survival. Britain in the early 1950s was not a wealthy and confident empire acting from a position of strength. It was a bankrupt and declining power desperately clinging to its last sources. That desperation made the British government willing to cross moral lines that it might not have crossed under different circumstances, proving that economic pressure can corrupt even the most established institutions. Mosaddegh himself has been historically vindicated by the passage of time, recognized by scholars and historians worldwide as a pioneering champion of national sovereignty and the rights of developing nations. His portrait hangs in the hearts of millions of Iranians today, not as a political symbol of any particular faction, but as a powerful reminder of what was stolen from them. He represented a possible future for Iran that was democratic, independent, and prosperous, a future that was deliberately and violently prevented from ever being realized by those who profited from its absence. The oil that caused so much suffering and conflict continues to flow from beneath the Iranian landscape today, still shaping the political destiny and international relationships of the nation that sits above it. Iran eventually gained genuine control over its own petroleum industry after the 1979 revolution. But the path to that ownership was soaked in decades of unnecessary suffering and political destruction. If the original demand for fair treatment had been honored peacefully in 1951, the entire subsequent history of Iran and the broader Middle East region might have unfolded in dramatically different ways. Instead, a bankrupt empire chose to fight rather than share, to destroy rather than negotiate, and to overthrow rather than respect the democratic choices of a sovereign people and nation. And so we return to where this story began, with one of the oldest civilizations on Earth discovering that a distant and financially desperate island nation controlled every single drop of its wealth. That discovery led to a democratic movement. That movement led to a coup. That coup led to a dictatorship. And that dictatorship led to a revolution whose consequences still echo. The chain of cause and effect stretches unbroken across more than a century of history. Connecting a handshake in 1901 to headlines that appear on our screens this very day, history does not simply happen to people. It is made by people, by their choices, their greed, their courage, and their willingness to either demand justice or deny it to others. The story of how a bankrupt Britain seized the wealth of Iran is ultimately a story about power and who gets to decide what belongs to whom in this complicated world. It is a story that every person alive today deserves to know, because the forces that shaped it have not disappeared. They have simply learned to disguise themselves in more modern clothing. Remember that beneath every modern headline about international conflict, there is almost always a buried history of broken promises, stolen resources, and silenced democratic voices waiting to be rediscovered and understood. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel. The past holds powerful lessons and I will help you discover them.